Greetings all, Nick here. How are you guys? First of all, thank you so much for the response to the last one of these X-Wing discussions. It's clear that you guys like this kind of video, so I'm going to do plenty more. Click the annotation up here if you want to see that discussion on dice rolling. Today we're going to talk a bit more about game design in X-Wing because it's just something that I'm a big fan of. It's something that I take a lot of interest in myself. I think if I wasn't sort of commentating on games on YouTube, I'd want to try and get into game design. It's something I find fascinating, and it's something I always like to have a chat about. Today we're going to talk about the development of ideas. And the reason I thought to make this video is because A, we have a new element coming into the game soon in Wave 14, which is sort of a progression of an old idea that we've seen before, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we have the example on screen. But also, I had a chat with one of you guys a little while back about a card, Wingman. Now, Wingman is an interesting card, and when I'm discussing lists and discussing X-Wing upgrades, I always like to justify my stance. You might find, and I've noticed this editing the last few list review videos I've done, I generally spend a lot more time explaining why I don't like something as opposed to when I do like something. If I like a list, I tend to be more succinct in my explanation of that. And when I don't like something or I don't think something's going to work, I think is a more correct way of putting that, I tend to have a much more long-winded explanation. And it's because I think just saying, no, this is bad and you shouldn't fly it is a bit condescending. You should always explain your stance. And, you know, X-Wing is a game like anything else. It's designed by a bunch of people. Not everything is fully even. Not all the cards work at the same power level. So there are right and wrong answers when it comes to, okay, if I want to do this, what's the best way to do it? There are cards that work better together and cards that don't work as well together. And I think it's important to justify why I think that. I might not always be right, but the fact of the matter is I think it is important to have that discussion. And the same applies to Wingman, because Wingman's a card that I don't think is that relevant going forward in the meta. I don't think it's going to be a card, barring some kind of amazing combo that happens to work with the restrictions of this card. I don't think this is a strong card, and I don't think it's ever going to be. And the reason for that is because of this idea of the progression in development of certain ideas in the game of X-Wing. Part of R&D in making tabletop games is a lot of throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. Sometimes you'll get things a bit too powerful or a bit underpowered on their first attempt, and you sort of tweak that, you go forward, and you want to try and get to a point where everything is around about the same power level. Wingman is an example of a design concept, that concept being you can remove stress from your friendly ships. Get rid of all the range one, the points cost and everything. The core design concept of Wingman is I remove stress from my friendly ships. And the fact of the matter is this is really the first attempt at doing this. And moving forward, FFG have realized, look, that's a bit too constrained. I think we can do this better, cheaper, more efficient. And that's really what I'm talking about in this video. We will talk about one example where I believe they got a concept too powerful on the first go and they had to sort of rein that in, but we'll talk a bit more about that later in the video. So let's bring up here in front of me. This is a spread of cards that really play around with the design of removing stress. Now I have here at the start of this spread Captain Yaw, because it actually came out before Wingman, and Captain Yaw doesn't specifically play around with this same design space, but it does very largely fulfill the same role. And I think I had to mention this because Captain Yaw, specifically now in the meta, with your Inquisitor and Quick Draw just tearing up local tournaments, it definitely is worth talking about. But nevertheless, this design behind Wingman, which is just you remove stress from your friendly ships rather than preemptively prevent it like Yaw, is something that hasn't really taken off. And we see here on the right hand side of this display here, Cassian Andor. And Cassian Andor, I think, is a much better application of what this design's meant to be, but unfortunately, or apart from anything else, Cassian's on a U-Wing, and that's not a very powerful ship in the meta. And it's worth looking at this because perhaps when the U-Wing potentially gets a fix in this new pack coming out in Wave 14, it may be a good concept going forward. It may be a useful strategy. But ultimately, moving forward in the game of X-Wing, we don't really have a great consistent way of doing what Wingman is trying to do, and it's a concept they're still working on. I will just give an honourable mention as well to Inspiring Recruit, because again, this sort of does what the card wants to do in that it makes your squad less susceptible to stress. However, in the case of Inspiring Recruit, you have to already be removing stress. And it's not at the core the design of Wingman. And I think there's a great chance that moving forward, we're going to see this concept come back in a more powerful and efficient way. So let's take a look at another card that came out a very long time ago. This was Wave 2, Marksmanship. It was a card that was very spicy, very fun. Basically, it kind of replaces the focus action, whereas if you take this action instead, you can only convert your focus result on attack, but one of those turns into a crit. And ultimately, this is another card that didn't really take off. It's a card that just proved to be a bit too narrow, a bit too costly. I mean, essentially, it's replacing the focus action and making its application a bit more narrow, and that's not worth 3 points. Honestly, I think we could do something like this for even 1 or 2 points in the current meta. I don't think that'd be too broken. But what Marksmanship at its core was trying to do was give us a more efficient way to convert focus results on attack. And there is a card in the current meta that is doing that efficiently. This is a concept that basically has found its feet, I guess, is what I want to be saying here. We take a look at the current card expertise, and we can see how FFG took a concept that didn't originally work and they applied it in such a way that it made sense. It stuck and it works. The great thing about expertise is it's a passive effect rather than an active effect. Passive meaning you don't need to take any actions or do anything with your ship to get the benefit of it. It's passive, you will get it on your attack so long as your ship is not stressed. And ultimately, this is something that has occurred with a lot of the older cards. A lot of them require actions. And actions is a great way to make a card unusable. I talked about Debris Gambit a while ago. This card is something I don't love because it requires an action to use. And its effect is not strictly better than just being able to take evade tokens. It's not strictly better than a lot of other actions you can take. And it's definitely not strictly better than a lot of other passive effects that you can be taking on the ship. And that's why I don't love this card. And I think moving forward, Debris Gambit was another example of FFG trying to hedge their bets, making sure the first time they play around with a design concept, they don't overcook it. And if this ever gets revisited, I can pretty much guarantee that it's going to be a bit easier to use. Maybe the effect is passive, maybe it still takes an action, but it's more powerful, the card's cheaper, whatever. And speaking of the cost of cards, certain upgrades play around with different kinds of actions. We had in the earlier days of the game various cards that used target locks. Now, I spoke about Han Solo at length in another video. I'm not very high on this card. I think it's an example of a design that didn't quite work out. Largely because in order to get the benefit of his card, you need to spend a target lock. And I said it in that video and I'll say it again, if you spend a target lock to do anything but firing missiles and torpedoes or just using a target lock regularly during an attack, it has to be a really, really powerful effect because that is costly. That is downright costly. Target locks are a great way to advance the board state because they often result in you inflicting more damage on your opponent. And that is everything in the game of X-Wing. For that reason, I was not very high on Han Solo. Yes, he gives you slightly better odds on your attack dice, but not good enough when you have to spend target locks, spend 2 points, and use up one of your crew slots. We also had Lat's Razzie back in Wave 7 on the YV666, and same deal again. Removing 1 agility from your opponent is a powerful move, but spending a target lock is just too costly, and that's ultimately why this card hasn't really taken off. Usually when we see the YV666 on the table, it is the Trandoshan Slaver, it is Bosk, Moralo Eval has his niche builds, but ultimately he's in the same camp as Lazrazi. Lazrazi is rarely the pilot you want to be taking on the YV666. It's an interesting concept. I like the concept. It's spending target locks in a way that is also a bit offensive. It helps you shoot your opponents more effectively, and maybe in the right circumstances, that target lock is less valuable than one of your opponent's agility points, but that's very niche and very narrow. Both of these cards in Lazrazi and Han Solo both spend target locks to do something offensive. The problem is target locks are already spent to do things that are offensive, and their application isn't powerful enough to capitalize on that value. It needs to be a lot of value to justify spending a target lock. Moving forward to some more recent cards, on the screen here we have in front of us, comparing Lazrazi and Han Solo, we have Nora Wexley and the Threat Tracker. And right here we can see how FFG have looked at this design concept, looked at, okay, spend target locks to do something else apart from their regular application and put it somewhere else in the game, give them another game effect. And you can see how on Nora Wexley and on the Threat Tracker we have a big payoff for spending target locks. Nora Wexley can add a focus result to her attack, and if you're unaware, the title for the Arc 170 means that can be turned into a critical. Maybe she has a focus token. She can guarantee, with her ability, in combination with her upgrades, to get more hit results. Generally, spending a target lock for its regular effect, just rerolling some of your dice, is not as good as just adding hit result. Adding hit result is the best way to modify your dice basically all the time. And the Threat Tracker means you can arc dodge. It basically nullifies one of your opponent's shots when used correctly. Again, this is a big game effect. Basically, you're able to completely negate one of your opponent's shots, and if you can prevent your opponent from shooting you, make their attacks less effective, or just prevent them from attacking at all, that is big. I don't need to tell you guys how big that is. If you've played this game, you know how basically capitalizing on your attacks, making sure you shoot your opponent more times than they shoot you back, is pretty much a core strategy moving forward to make sure you are winning games. Now moving forward, and I want to talk about something in the game of X-Wing that's going to come out soon. It's going to come out in Wave 14 on the TIE Reaper expansion pack, and that's the Death Troopers. And the reason I'm very interested in this, and potentially slightly worried about the power level of this card, although I think it'll be fine. I think FFG are well aware of the problems that this kind of effect can have on the game, and they've really thought this through. Guys, if you haven't watched Team Covenant interview Alex Davies, I believe it was during last December, they had a good chat about the card Biggs. Now, Alex Davies was not part of the core design team of X-Wing right from the start. He didn't help design Wave 1. But when he joined that team, he said, look, right from the start, I thought Biggs was a problem because it's parasitic on the gameplay. And I can see what he means. Biggs plays around with a core part of the gameplay, which is targeting priority. Preventing your opponent from being able to choose certain targets can be backbreaking. And again, I did another whole video on Biggs and why throughout the waves he's become more and more powerful, and that ultimately led to his nerf last November. And I think his game effect has always been very interesting. And when I look at Death Troopers, I think, hey, this is very much the same thing that Biggs was doing, but they've really toned it down a little bit. I mean, they put it on another faction. That alone changes the context of what this kind of game effect is doing. What I'm talking about here, the core design element, is changing the options for your opponent to shoot you. And Death Troopers does not, like Biggs originally said, prevent your opponent from choosing certain targets. It just punishes your opponent slightly with stress control. It's good passive stress control. I've talked about stress control before. We have cards like Victor Hell and Asajj Ventress. I think in the case of Asajj Ventress, this is probably what you want to be doing with stress control. You want good passive stress control that's going to trigger a lot. And if you build around Death Troopers effectively, I think it's going to be something that works quite often. And the reason I'm worried about it is because, again, we're taking this game design element, putting it into a new faction, and somebody might find a way to break that. So fingers crossed it's not too powerful, but I think this is going to be a great card going forward. On the spread here in front of my face, you can see what I'm talking about. Biggs was the original card that used this concept. It was deemed too parasitic because it basically prevented choices full stop in your opponent, and that is not really what the game of X-Wing wants to be doing. A few waves ago we had Lorik, and that's doing a very similar thing that Biggs does, but it's just providing protection to other nearby ships. What we've seen in recent lists is basically Lorik replacing what Biggs used to do. But I think if we look at this critically, Lorik doesn't really do exactly what Biggs did. It doesn't change targeting priority, it just makes it harder to shoot certain targets. And you can just fight through that with raw attrition. It doesn't really work in the same way Biggs used to. And I think taking Biggs out of the meta by giving him that nerf, it's really taken this game design element out of the game. And look, despite that fact of that being a bit parasitic, I think FFG have realised, hey, this was interesting, it had build-arounds, it was spicy, people like to play around with Biggs, and now they're offering us Death Troopers as a way to go, okay, look, we're going to approach this again, but we're really going to be cautious with this time, guys, because it was scary. Fairship Rebels for a while there was a very unfun list to play against. I'm not going to beat around the bush there. It was brutal. So yes, just bringing all of this back to my original point. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because I was asked about Wingman. And this applies to a lot of other cards in X-Wing, but I often find that newer players in particular look at all the cards available to us in X-Wing and go, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting. And I just want you guys to be aware of the context of why these cards were designed, the environment they were designed in, and the progression of the concepts they were working on. Because sometimes we have these old cards that unfortunately didn't quite hit the mark. And there are just newer, more potent versions of those cards that should be considered. Now, that's not to say that you should never consider cards like Wingman. Perhaps one day there will be a combination that makes it powerful. Perhaps one day you'll need to have 2 points on the EPT slot and you need to get a combination working at range 1 because it has some amazing synergy. I don't think that's the case right now. But obviously these cards are not strict upgrades on each other. They do slightly different game effects, but they do play around with the core design space. And really, if you want a basic effect in your list that doesn't rely on any combo or synergy, look towards these cards that basically have improved on the concept. Look towards these cards that do things more efficiently, because FFG watch this kind of stuff and they craft cards in the newer waves to be more efficient. I think the more cynical amongst us might consider that kind of thing power creep. Honestly, I think it's more refining of these design concepts and it's making sure that all these new cards are effective in the game of X-Wing. There is some degree of power creep in the game of X-Wing, but I don't think necessarily more powerful is strictly an example of that. And I think it's just something good to be aware of when crafting lists. Anyway guys, thank you again for watching another long boring video of me talking about game design. I do love this kind of stuff. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and I will catch you later.